Keisha Monroe exhaled quietly as she sank into seat 14A, the window seat she had deliberately chosen. A small act of control in a world that often felt anything but predictable. She had paid extra for it, not for the prestige, but for the peace. For her, the window wasn't just a view, it was a sanctuary, a place to disappear into clouds, to lose herself in pages, to let her thoughts drift as far as the horizon. The soft hum of the aircraft, the shuffle of passengers stowing their luggage overhead, the distant call of flight attendants, none of it bothered her. It was background noise to her own quiet ritual. She had come prepared, a new novel, noise-canceling headphones, and a firm hope that the next few hours would pass with minimal conversation and maximum solitude. For someone who was constantly navigating the world with measured politeness and guarded grace, this seat represented a rare moment of ease. Outside the oval window, rain dotted the glass in delicate patterns, and Keisha allowed herself a small smile. The city below was already slipping away, and soon the clouds would take over. She liked that. The separation, the in-between space of air travel where no one needed anything from you. She adjusted her seatbelt, flipped open her book, and let her body relax into the cushioned chair. This was hers, not just because she paid for it, but because she earned moments like this, quiet, earned rest, carved out from days that often asked too much. The aisle buzzed with passengers boarding last minute, their energy urgent and unbothered. But Keisha had what she needed, a sense of stillness in a chaotic world. She didn't notice the man and child approaching at first. It wasn't until a shadow fell across her that she looked up. The interruption was sudden, jarring, and unfamiliar. She blinked, unsure of what was coming, but deep down she could already feel it. The quiet moment was about to be stolen, not by accident, but by expectation. And with that realization came a flicker of something else. Tiredness, not just from travel, but from constantly being asked to give more than she should have to. The moment shattered like glass. Keisha looked up, startled from the pages of her book, to find a man towering over her, well-dressed, assertive, and already annoyed. His voice wasn't angry, not yet, but it carried something heavier, entitlement. "I need you to move," he said, as if it were a given, not a request. Standing beside him was a little girl, 6 years old at most, holding a stuffed rabbit and avoiding eye contact. There was something uncertain in her posture, something soft. But the man beside her? He was steel. Keish blinked, confused for a moment, trying to process what was being asked. When he gestured toward the aisle seat next to her, it became clear. He wanted the window for his daughter. Keisha's chest tightened, not in anger, not yet, but in disappointment. She had hoped this flight would be simple, quiet, uncomplicated. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her voice even. She didn't owe an explanation, but still she added, "I paid for this seat." That should have been enough. But it wasn't. The man, Richard, according to the luggage tag on his carry-on, looked genuinely stunned, as if the word no was a foreign concept. His reaction shifted quickly from disbelief to subtle condescension. "She's a child," he repeated, slower now, like Keisha hadn't understood. But she understood perfectly. She understood that this was not about kindness, it was about assumption, about power, about a man who expected the world to bend for him because it usually did. She could see it in the Rolex on his wrist, in the way he stood too close, too confident. There was pressure in the air, thick and immediate, not just from him, but from the weight of knowing exactly how this would be perceived. If she refused, she'd be seen as cold, unreasonable. If she gave in, she'd surrender a tiny piece of herself, the part that knew she had every right to stay where she was. And that is where the real burden lay, the quiet cost of always being expected to yield. But even as Richard's voice grew louder and his indignation began to spill over, Keisha didn't shrink. She sat still, firm, polite, but unmovable. because sometimes dignity looks like doing nothing at all except refusing to give in. Keisha could feel it, the shift. It wasn't just Richard anymore, it was the eyes, the silence that filled the space between words, the judgment that hovered in the air like static. Richard, with his performative outrage and well-rehearsed indignation, had turned her quiet refusal into a public spectacle. His voice rose deliberately, not in anger but in performance, amplified for the cabin to hear. "This is what's wrong with people today," he declared. "No basic decency." The words weren't meant for her, they were meant for them, the audience. He was framing her as the villain, the cold-hearted woman who wouldn't switch seats for a nervous child. And it was working. Keisha felt heat creep up her neck, her pulse drumming steady beneath her skin. She could sense the discomfort of the passengers around her, some stealing glances, others refusing to look at all, retreating into their own silence. That silence hurt more than the stares. It was complicity, a quiet suggestion that maybe, just maybe, Richard had a point. But Keisha knew what this was. She had seen it before. This wasn't a simple seat dispute. It was a moral ambush, a setup, a test she never agreed to take. And in this test she was expected to surrender her right to say no, because to refuse, especially as a black woman, was to be painted as unfeeling, difficult, selfish. She gripped her book tighter, trying to anchor herself to something real, something solid. But the pressure was mounting, crushing in its quiet violence. Sandra's presence brought a flicker of relief, but even then Keisha watched her closely. Flight attendants had a difficult job. Would she fold under Richard's performance? Would she, too, ask Keisha to move for the sake of peace? But Sandra didn't waver. She stood tall, clear-eyed, stating firmly that Keisha was in the right. Still, the emotional toll lingered, because what Richard had tried to steal wasn't just her seat. It was her right to exist without being tested. And in moments like this, the expectation is always the same. Be gracious, be gentle, be better, even when no one else is. Keisha didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry or argue. She simply stayed. And somehow, in a world that demands so much from people like her, that simple act of staying became an act of defiance. The tide was turning. Keisha could feel it, not just in the way Sandra squared her shoulders, but in the subtle ripple that moved through the cabin. Richard, who moments ago had commanded the space with his bluster, now stood on uncertain ground. His words, once loud and confident, were beginning to echo back at him. Passengers who had been silent were now leaning in, watching, some even murmuring their agreement with Keisha. And when Sandra gave her final warning, when her voice dropped into something colder and sharper, "Sir, I will notify the captain," it became clear that this wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was a reckoning. Keisha sat motionless, her heart still racing, but something had shifted inside her, too. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. She was tired, yes, but also rooted. Grounded in the truth of her own boundaries, Richard, sensing his control slipping, tried one last time to wound her, muttering, "I wouldn't want my daughter sitting next to someone like you anyway." The venom behind his words was unmistakable, and still Keisha didn't flinch. Because she knew what this was. A man unraveling in real time, unable to handle the one thing he'd never been taught to accept, being told no. Then came Javier, tall and composed, stepping into the aisle with quiet force. His presence didn't escalate, it affirmed. The rules weren't flexible anymore. There was no moral gray area left to hide in. Sandra and Javier, standing united, gave Richard a choice. Return to your seat or be removed. It was no longer a debate. It was consequence. And for a split second, the man who had tried to publicly shame Keisha, who weaponized kindness, morality, and even his child, was speechless. His chest rose, lips parted, but there were no words left to spin. The power had drained from his stance, and all that remained was pride and fear of losing it. As he finally turned away, gripping his daughter's hand and stomping back to his row, Keisha released the breath she'd been holding. Not because she had won, not because he had lost, but because, for once, someone like her had been seen, heard, and protected, not just by policy, but by people willing to say, "This stops here." When Richard was finally escorted off the plane, a strange hush fell over the cabin. It wasn't triumphant, not quite. It wasn't relief either. It was something more complex, a collective exhale, the kind that only comes after witnessing someone push too far and face the consequences they never thought would reach them. Passengers glanced at one another, some shaking their heads, others whispering under their breath, but no one dared say much aloud. Keisha remained still, her body pressed lightly against the window, watching the blur of tarmac outside as if it could somehow wash away the tension still clinging to her shoulders. She wasn't proud. She wasn't gloating. She was simply exhausted, because she knew something many others didn't. That if she had responded with just a little more frustration, if her voice had risen even slightly, the outcome might have been very different. She would have been labeled aggressive, disruptive, the problem. That was the quiet cruelty of these moments. You're asked to defend yourself, but only in ways that don't make anyone uncomfortable, only in ways that still let you be perceived as civil. And somehow she had managed to walk that tightrope again. Still, it shouldn't have gotten this far. All of this over a seat? A window seat she paid for, fair and square. And yet, it became a stage where her value was debated, her composure tested, her dignity questioned. That was the part that lingered, not Richard's words, not even his venom, but the unspoken expectation that she, once again, should have been the bigger person, should have smiled, should have moved. But she hadn't. She had stayed. As the flight attendants reset, as the aircraft prepared for takeoff, Sandra paused by Keisha's row one last time. "If you need anything, let us know," she said quietly. Keisha nodded, offering a small, grateful smile. And then finally she leaned back in her seat, placing her hand gently on her book, and turned once more toward the window. Not because she needed to escape, but because she had reclaimed what was hers in a world that constantly demanded her silence, her compliance, her accommodation. She had said no. And sometimes that quiet refusal is everything. As the plane finally lifted from the runway, slicing through thick clouds and into the muted blue of the evening sky, Keisha sat still, not out of peace, but out of deep, measured reflection. Her seat 14A now felt less like a place she had simply paid for, and more like a symbol of something far greater. She had held it, yes, but the cost of holding it hadn't been money alone. It had been emotional labor, the weight of expectation, the discomfort of being judged for doing exactly what anyone else would have done without question. She had not shouted, she had not insulted anyone, she had simply said no. And still, for that, she had been put on trial in the court of public opinion, right there in the narrow aisle of a commercial jet. She turned her gaze back to the clouds, her reflection faint in the window. People often talked about strength like it was loud, like it had to roar to be real. But Keisha knew better. Sometimes strength looked like sitting still while the world demanded you move. Sometimes it meant resisting not just the person in front of you, but the centuries of unspoken pressure behind them, the pressure that said, "Give in, be nice, don't make a scene." She had made no scene, Richard had done that. She had simply stood her ground, quiet, firm, dignified. And yet she knew that if she'd been anyone else, older, white, male, perhaps she wouldn't have been challenged at all. That was the bitter truth sitting beneath her calm, and it stung. But it also reminded her of who she was, of how many times she had been asked to be understanding, to be the one who accommodates, who softens the tension so others don't have to feel it. Not today. Today she stayed seated, and in doing so she sent a message, not one written in outrage or confrontation, but in stillness, in boundary, in knowing her worth. It wasn't just about a seat. It never was. It was about the right to claim space without apology, about not being guilted out of what was hers. And as the clouds broke open into streaks of fading gold, Keisha closed her eyes, not because she was retreating, but because she had nothing to prove. She had already won. This was never just a story about a seat. It was about something older, deeper. The battle between entitlement and quiet resolve, between those who expect the world to yield and those who are told to step aside for the sake of keeping peace. Richard's outburst wasn't about a nervous child or a window view. It was about ego, about a man so used to control that the smallest resistance shattered his sense of power. And in contrast stood Keisha, a woman who dared to say one simple word, no, and held it like a shield, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with stillness. And that stillness spoke volumes.
Because in a world that too often demands silence in the face of injustice, these small acknowledgements were a kind of courage. And they reminded Keisha that while dignity may be carried alone, it is never truly solitary. Her refusal to move wasn't just about herself anymore. It became a quiet call to others, a reminder that standing your ground can be a shared act, even when you're the only one sitting still. In the end, no one applauded, but they remembered, and maybe, next time, someone else would be the first to speak. Or better yet, no one would have to. Keisha didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue, insult, or lash out. And because of that, because she held her composure from start to finish, many might walk away from the moment thinking it wasn't that serious, but they would be wrong. The truth is, what happened to Keisha wasn't a simple disagreement or a misunderstanding over a seat. It was a battle of perception, and she had to fight it silently, with measured words, with stillness, with every ounce of restraint she could summon. That's what people so often miss. When you're forced to be composed in the face of disrespect, you're not unbothered, you're just protecting yourself. Every time she spoke, she had to choose her tone carefully, knowing that the smallest shift could become ammunition against her. She couldn't roll her eyes, couldn't show frustration, couldn't meet Richard's venom with her own, because if she had shown even a glimpse of the anger she felt, she knew how quickly the narrative could flip. She would have become the aggressive one, the problem, the angry black woman. She had learned that lesson long ago, and so she wore her composure like armor, even as it drained her. What people don't see is how much energy it takes to stay calm under pressure that you never invited, to be publicly challenged, morally judged, and emotionally cornered, and still respond with grace. It's not ease, it's endurance, it's survival, and it comes with a cost. After Richard was gone, after the cabin settled, Keisha didn't feel victorious. She felt tired, not just from the incident, but from the lifelong habit of managing other people's comfort before her own. And yet, even in her exhaustion, she didn't regret it, because her stillness wasn't weakness. It was strength, quiet, disciplined, and deeply rooted in self-respect. She hadn't needed to prove anything to anyone, but by staying calm, she protected her truth. And for those watching, especially those who have walked that same tightrope, her composure became something more than restraint. It became a reminder: just because someone doesn't scream, doesn't mean they're not fighting. In the end, Keisha didn't move. And that mattered, not because it was defiant, not because it caused a scene, but because it affirmed something we don't talk about enough: the quiet power of holding your ground. Her decision to stay seated wasn't about pride. It wasn't stubbornness. It was about self-worth, about reclaiming space in a world that too often demands people like her, black women, quiet women, women who know their value to step aside for the sake of someone else's comfort. She refused to do that, and in doing so she left a mark, not only on those who witnessed it, but on the shape of the conversation itself. Keisha didn't leave that flight with applause or recognition. There was no celebration waiting for her, no medal for enduring what she did. But she walked away with something far more lasting, her dignity intact. She didn't let shame bend her. She didn't let pressure rewrite her boundaries. And perhaps most powerfully, she reminded everyone on that plane, and anyone who would later hear her story, that no one should have to shrink to be seen as good. For too long, we've romanticized silence as grace and obedience as virtue. But Keisha's silence wasn't submission. It was clarity. Her stillness wasn't passivity. It was presence. She didn't meet Richard's noise with more noise. She simply refused to be moved. And in that refusal, she reminded us that respect isn't something to be earned through pleasing others. It's a right, a basic human right, that should never come second to entitlement or ego. Perhaps most telling was how the moment ended, not in confrontation, but in stillness. She turned toward the window, not to escape, but to reflect. And in that quiet space, she became more than just a passenger on a flight. She became a mirror, showing us how quickly pressure disguises itself as politeness, how easily power masks itself as a plea for kindness. And so, when we ask what it means to stand up for ourselves, perhaps the better question is, what does it mean to stay seated when everything around you is demanding that you move? Keisha answered that with grace, and her answer echoed far beyond row 14. Life lesson. The power of quiet strength. In life, we're often taught that kindness means giving in, that doing the right thing sometimes means sacrificing our own comfort to avoid conflict. But this story reminds us that dignity is not selfish, and standing your ground doesn't make you unkind. It makes you whole. For many, especially those who have spent a lifetime yielding for the sake of peace, it's a powerful reminder your boundaries matter. Keisha didn't argue or fight. She simply held her space with calm and grace, even when pressure mounted around her. And sometimes, that kind of quiet strength speaks louder than any words ever could. As we grow older, we gain a deeper understanding of what truly matters: respect, fairness, and self-worth. This story invites us to reflect on how we treat others, but also how we treat ourselves. Are we still allowing others to push us past our limits, or are we finally choosing to honor our voice? Because no matter your age, race, or background, you deserve to take up space in this world without apology. And sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is simply not move.